So when that happens, we turn to the market. And that's where financial markets really come to the forefront and really come into their own. Financial markets are incredibly good at figuring out these kinds of things. It's called the wisdom of crowds, a term coined by the Wall Street Journal reporter and author James Surowiecki. This idea that if you use the collective wisdom of a large group like this classroom, we can learn some amazing things. And the example that I use in my introductory finance class is this terrible event that occurred on January the 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded shortly after flight. At 11:39 a.m. on that day, the Space Shuttle Challenger took off, and within seconds after it lifted off, it started to break apart. And it was a horrific sight. Those of you who are old enough to remember that incident, I'm sure you remember exactly where you were when that occurred. I certainly remember. It was really a shocking experience. And shortly after it occurred, the various different news sources had nothing to say about the event. One of the large vendors for the space shuttle, Lockheed, had no comment. Rockwell International had no comment. And it wasn't until President Reagan appointed the Rogers Commission and they went through a 5.5-month examination, literally sifting through the wreckage of the space shuttle, interviewing hundreds of experts and employees of NASA and the various different companies, that they finally came to the conclusion that was described in a really compelling testimony by physicist Richard Feynman, that it was the infamous O-ring that was at fault. It's a piece of rubber that was meant to seal a particular seam on the booster rocket. And because this rocket was launched in sub-zero degree temperatures, that rubber became brittle and the seal no longer held, allowing vapors to escape, and those vapors were ignited upon liftoff, creating this explosion along the way. It took 5.5 months to come up with this, but it turns out that the stock market actually figured this out in approximately 3 hours on the day of the explosion. Now, how do we know that? Well, because a couple of economists decided to look through the data and ask the question, on the day of the explosion, January the 28th, 1986, after 11:39 a.m., how did the stock prices of the 4 companies that were involved in developing parts for the space shuttle, how did they do? And the 4 companies were Lockheed, Martin Marietta, Rockwell International, and Morton Thiokol. And it was Morton Thiokol that produced the booster rockets with those O-rings. So they looked at the data, and what they found was absolutely shocking. What they found was that on the day of the explosion, starting at 11:30, as they tracked the prices of these 4 stocks, they all went down in price, but one stock had so much volume on it that the New York Stock Exchange had to temporarily suspend trading. And you know whose company stock that was? Yeah, it was Morton Thiokol. This happened within minutes after the explosion. And these authors looked at the stock price performance over the course of the day, and they're all normalized to 1 at 11:30. And you can see that by the end of the day, one particular company got hit hardest, and that company's stock price went down to the extent that it actually ultimately captured the approximate costs to that company of this terrible incident. And that company was Morton Thiokol. That's a shocking result, don't you think? The fact that within minutes, the stock market figured out something that took this Rogers Commission 5.5 months to come up with. Now, of course, they didn't know about the O-ring, but very quickly they identified that Morton Thiokol was the culprit. This is the wisdom of crowds. And by the way, let me add very quickly that Morton Thiokol may have borne the brunt of this incident, but it's not at all clear that they were at fault, because Morton Thiokol engineers had sent memos to NASA months beforehand warning them that they could not launch in sub-zero degree weather, precisely because of this incident. And how NASA ended up deciding to go ahead anyway is the subject of a number of case studies in organizational behavior. I won't have time to go into that. I would urge you to take a look at it. It's a fascinating story, a very important story about how even people with the best of intentions can fail in some dramatic ways. But the point is that the stock market, knowing none of this, quickly figured out that it was the booster rockets company that was going to get hit the hardest. And that's the wisdom of crowds. This is what James Surowiecki was talking about. It looked like it was the wisdom of crowds. And if we had more time, I would actually show you that here by using this example that Surowiecki points out, which is the old bean jar experiment. I'm going to ask you to guess the number of jelly beans in the jar. Any one of you most likely would come up with a guess that is far off from the actual number. But if I took all of your guesses and I averaged them, remarkably, I would get to within a few beans of the actual number. And that's the wisdom of crowds. From mathematical perspectives, the way to think about it is if each of you is coming up with an estimate of the actual number x, but you're measuring x with error, you're guessing. As long as two things happen, the wisdom of crowds will give us a very, very good answer. And the two things are, number one, you need a crowd for the wisdom of crowds. And this crowd is actually pretty good. And the second thing you need is you need wisdom. By wisdom, I don't mean that all of you need to be wise, but you need to be statistically independent so that those of you who are wrong in one direction will cancel out those of you who are wrong in the other direction. And when you average all of your various different guesses, the mistakes average out to zero. That's the law of large numbers. And that's how the wisdom of crowds operates.